Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of makeup experimentation. I recently shared in my holiday wishlist video that I have my eyes on Huda Beauty's new Mercury Retrograde palette. I think the color story is absolutely beautiful, it speaks to my soul, and yet it's $67 and I already own New Nude, and I feel like there seems to be a fair amount of shade overlap between this palette and that one, to the point where I felt like I couldn't really justify also purchasing that guy. So this got me to thinking, because I feel like so often those of us with large makeup collections, especially large eyeshadow palette collections, talk about being able to dupe new palettes with things we already have in our existing collection. But how often do we actually sit down and try to dupe those palettes? I know I personally am guilty of saying it more than I actually do it, so I thought today I could, be true to my word and see if I could in fact dupe the new Mercury Retrograde palette with shadows I have in my existing collection. Now, if you are looking for more stuff to watch after you finish this video, I will throw my last Can I Dupe It video up here in the cards for you guys, where I essentially did the same thing. I was lusting after Jouer's Tan Lines palette, and I was able to recreate it with single eyeshadows that I already had from ColourPop and some other brands. So if you want to watch that, you can check it out there. But for today, we are actually going through all of my existing palettes as opposed to my collection of single shadows, because I actually had better luck finding dupe shades within those than with my singles. However, as you guys are about to find out, when asked the question, how many palettes does it take to dupe the Mercury Retrograde palette, the answer is kind of a lot. I was surprised to see, once I was actually looking at swatches of the Mercury Retrograde palette, that New Nude does not have a ton of exact shade overlap. I feel like you are getting similar tones. You definitely could create similar looks with a lot of the shades, but as far as things that are close and dupable, they're actually pretty different palettes. So that meant that I needed to go into all of my drawers and onto my shelf and pull out a whole bunch of stuff to see if I could find shades that I thought were actually pretty close to the ones in Mercury Retrograde. And I think I did a pretty decent job. I'm excited to show you guys what I came up with. And we are also going to use those eyeshadows to create the look that I'm wearing right now. So if you guys are ready to learn what I used to recreate the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette with my existing collection and how I did this look, we're about to get into it. So I think I want to kick things off with the tutorial portion of today's video. I'm going to show you guys how I created this purple blue smoky eye situation using some shades from palettes I already have that were inspired by the ones in Mercury Retrograde. So let's go ahead and rewind the clock and I will show you how this came together. So I really have absolutely no plan of attack for this eye look right now. I'm just going to look at the swatches of the Huda palette and see what inspires me and kind of make it up as I go and just see what we can come up with. So I'm going to start out with a really soft transition, and in the Mercury Retrograde palette there is this very soft peach matte color called Momentum. So I think from the New Nude palette we can use the shade Play. I think that one will look very similar on the eyes. And I am just going to put this kind of high up in my crease, sort of right below the brow bone. Now, I feel like the appeal of this Mercury Retrograde palette is the top row of shades, which have the beautiful blues and aquas and purples that are not in the New Nude. So I really want to try to utilize those dupe shades that I have in my collection as a way of keeping myself from buying this palette. Now, I had a surprisingly difficult time finding a dupe for the shade Libra, which is this matte sort of pinky lavender color in the Mercury Retrograde palette. The closest thing I could find was from the Beauty Crop Sangria palette, and it's the shade Salute right here, which is also a matte light purple, but this is a little bit deeper, I think, than Libra is. Either way, it's the closest we've got, so I'm gonna roll with that. I'm taking a smaller, fluffy brush, and I'm gonna put that into the inner portion of my crease. I will say though, this shade does definitely pack a punch from this palette. Now I think one of the standout shades from Mercury Retrograde is the matte, bright, aqua-y teal color. It's absolutely gorgeous, and honestly, I did not have anything exactly like this in my collection. I had something that I think was a bit deeper and something that was a bit lighter. So for today's look, I'm gonna err on the lighter side. I'm gonna shoot for using this shade Minty, which is in the Beauty Crop Mojito palette. It's maybe a little more green and a little less blue than what's in Mercury Retrograde, but we'll see how it looks on the eyes. And I am gonna put this, I think, right into this outer portion of my crease. Now I think for my lid, I want to kind of do a blue, purple, teal, ombre kind of effect, kind of mirroring what I did with the matte shades. So I think I'm gonna go darkest to lightest actually, just because again, I have no idea what I'm doing right now. So I'm gonna go in with the dupe for the shade Mercury from the Mercury Retrograde palette, which is the really dark, beautiful, tealy shimmer shade. And I thought the shade Veradero from this Reina del Caribe palette from LR Cosmetics might be pretty similar. If anything, I feel like the shade is actually kind of in between these two guys, so maybe I could even like mix them together. So I'm gonna put this right into the outer corner, just like tapping that on with my finger, because this is a really intense shade, and then I'm gonna kind of blend it out at the edges. Ooh, man, this is such a beautiful shade. Honestly, this is one of the colors that makes this entire eyeshadow palette. I love it so much. And then I'm gonna go back in with that minty shade and that brush and kind of just like soften out that edge. I think I'm gonna take a little bit of Veradero on a small flat brush as well, just to blend it a little more. Yeah. That shade is so pigmented, holy cow. So next I want to blend this into a purple tone, and I'm thinking I want to use a dupe for Ultraviolet from the Mercury Retrograde palette. And the thing that I thought might be closest is the shade Shookington here from my Jackie Aina palette from ABH. So we're just going to go back in with this little flat, wet, and wild brush. I'm going to pick up a little bit of this on here, and we're just going to swipe this across the lid. And I'm also going to go back in with that very, very first play shade. Just hit the very edges of everything. Now this next shade, I honestly don't even know if it's really a dupe for the shade in this palette, because I feel like the shade in the Mercury Retrograde palette could be duochromatic or not. It's hard to tell from these swatches alone, but I feel like this shade I'm about to show you does have a similar vibe, or at least would definitely go well in the same kind of spot in this palette, if you know what I mean. So for the shade Supermoon, I'm gonna use this shade here called Plumeria from the LA Girl Hot Hot Heat palette in Aloha Vibes. This is a really cool shade in that it's got a really strong purple duochromatic shift to it. So it looks kind of silvery gray in the pan, but then it also shifts really pretty and purple. So I feel like this would be cool to kind of layer over what we've got on the lid right here. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of this with my finger, yeah, and I'm just going to layer this guy right on top. Oh yeah, I feel like that adds a really cool effect. Then for the inner corner of the eye, I thought I might want to use a dupe for the shade Cosmic, which is a light shimmery lavendery purple color. And I thought maybe the shade Daydream from the Huda Beauty New Nude palette would be very similar to that. And then for the lower lash line, I'm feeling like I want to do something a little contrasting, but that also pulls in the peach tone that we put kind of close to the brow bone. So I'm going to use the dupe I found for the shade Utopia, which is a matte coral. So I'm going to use the shade Meadow from the ColourPop Sweet Talk palette. Then I'm just going to take some of that light peach shade called Play Again, and I'm just going to buff that out. Alright, cool. I like where we are at so far, so I think to finish off this look, I'm just going to throw on some liner and lashes, and then I will be back to show you guys my full palette worth of swatches. Alright guys, so here is the completed final look. I feel like liner and lashes really just made this, as is the case a lot of the times with very dramatic, colorful looks like this. And honestly, even if the shades that I just put on my eyes were not exact dupes to the Mercury Retrograde, I still love the look that I came up with, and I appreciate having that color story to inspire me to create this look, because honestly, I don't think I normally would have thought to reach for all of those palettes to do something like this. And that is a perfect segue into the swatch portion of today's video, and for us to have a little conversation about how many palettes, in fact, it actually took for me to recreate this 18-pan eyeshadow palette. Honestly, I think I was banking on being able to dupe more from this palette than I ended up being able to. Like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, while there are certain colors in here that I feel like are similar in tone to Mercury Retrograde, there aren't actually a lot of dupes. While I've always thought of this being a very pink and purple palette, when you look at this next to the swatches of Mercury Retrograde, I feel like it does end up appearing quite a bit more neutral, which is weird. So while I do still feel like these palettes are similar, and you could probably create looks that have a similar vibe to them with this palette and that one, they really are fairly different palettes. So let me take you through what I did think was a dupe from this palette into the Mercury Retrograde, along with all the other palettes that I needed to pull shades from. So the first shade is called Cosmic. This one is a shimmery lilac purple. And while I didn't have anything exactly like this, I felt like the shade Daydream was a pretty close dupe, and this is what I used in the inner corner of my eye today. I have a feeling that this is going to be kind of difficult to swatch given how many shades there are in these palettes, but I'll do my best. I'll definitely insert some clips for you guys so you can see what they look like a little bit better. Alright, so the next shade in the palette is called Utopia, and this is a vibrant coral matte shade. Now, there really isn't anything remotely similar to that in this palette, so I was able to find something similar in the Sweet Talk palette from ColourPop, and this is the shade Melody. Now, I have a feeling that both Melody and Dreammaker here, these are fairly close, and without actually seeing the original palette, I don't know which of these is honestly a closer dupe. But I decided to go with Melody just because this is a little bit more of a richer and more vibrant tone. Then next is the shade Ultraviolet, which is a more blue-toned purple with a shimmering finish. Now, I actually had quite a few purple shimmery shades in my collection, but as far as finding one that had that same bluish tone to it as opposed to one that leaned a little more cranberry, I think the closest match I could find was Shookington from the ABH Jackie Aina palette. I feel like this shade is maybe a little less shiny than the one in the Huda palette. It's kind of hard to tell. This one has almost more of a satiny like finish to it, but I feel like the tone of the color is fairly similar. I think the shade I stressed the most about trying to dupe was the next one, which is Nebula. This is a very unique shade, actually. It's kind of a bluish purple steely gray color with an intense chromatic, like metallicized finish to it. And I do have several like gray shimmery tones or like silvery tones, but this has that bluish purpliness to it that is a little bit unique. However, I was really happy to see that the shade Fantasize in my Noblesse Secret palette actually has a lot of similarities to that shade. Now, I will say this much. Fantasize is more of almost like a topper shade. It has less base pigment and more sparkle to it, so it's maybe not as intense as the one in the Huda palette, but you could theoretically like wet this guy to give it more punch. Next is the shade Mercury, which is a beautiful shimmering tealy blue color. Honestly, this is definitely one of the standout shades in the palette. And I went with Veradero from the Alamar Cosmetics Reina del Caribe palette as my dupe shade. As I mentioned in the tutorial, I honestly feel like the shade is probably somewhere in between these two. So, I mean, you could theoretically mix them if you already had this palette. But for now, I'm just gonna swatch Veradero because I feel like it does actually look fairly similar all on its own. Another really standout shade that I had a slightly difficult time duping was Haze, which is the matte, vibrant teal color. So I went with the shade Minty from the Beauty Crop Mojito palette, but I do feel like this shade is maybe a little lighter and a little bit more green than Haze is. So that is what it looks like swatched. It's not the most intense shade in a swatch, but I feel like it does build up nicely on the eyes. The only other option that I had that I felt could be similar was a single from ColourPop called Formation, but I feel like this guy is just a little bit too dark, so I decided to err on the side of caution and go with the lighter shade for my dupe palette. Now, the next shade I felt I was able to dupe pretty easily from New Nude, and that is the shade Off Balance, which is one of those dusty rose tones. For this, I went with the shade Tickle, which I feel like does seem very, very similar. Now, the next shade is called Galaxy, and this seems like a shimmering champagne. And at first, I was gonna dupe this shade with Crave from the New Nude palette. However, I felt like that one was a better dupe for another color we're gonna get to later. So instead, I decided to go back to ABH here and use the shade Soleil, which is a really gorgeous shimmery champagne that I feel like is very similar in tone. Finally, the last shade in the top row is Libra, which is another matte. This one I really couldn't find an exact dupe for. I don't have a bright lilac purple that's quite this tone. In the New Nude palette, there is a light purpley shade called Lace, but this one is a lot less vibrant. It has more of almost a grayiness to it, so I feel like it's completely different from Libra. Instead, I reached for my Beauty Crop Sangria palette, and I went into the shade Salud, which I don't think is quite like Libra in that it's a bit darker, but at least I felt like it channeled more of those matte purple vibes than the one in the Huda New Nude palette. Alright, so there is our first row of swatches. Let's move on to the second row. Now, this arguably is a much more neutral row than the first one, and there were a few more dupe shades in this row from the New Nude than in the previous row. Like right off the bat, the shade Crash, I feel like I can dupe with this shade down here called Secret, and the shade Momentum, which is a light peach, I can dupe with the shade Play. So let me swatch those two quick. Oh, I feel like my arm does not turn in a way that's very conducive for you guys to be able to see these until the end. I'll insert some clips and then you'll have much better visualization, I promise. Then there was the shade Supermoon, which I mentioned during the tutorial. I felt like I had a little bit of a difficult time trying to dupe because I feel like this is one of those shades that in person is probably way more unique than it looks in the swatch. So I was pretty proud of myself actually for finding the shade in this palette, which is called Plumeria, which is that really beautiful purpley greigey duochrome. This maybe isn't quite as vibrant and light as Supermoon, because that one seems a little more ethereal, maybe a little more iridescent, but you know, for the purpose of what we're doing today, I feel like it works well enough. Another one that was surprisingly tricksy to dupe is Vortex. This is a really, really dark plummy brown color. And while I have tons of dark browns, finding one that had this kind of plummy tone to it was actually quite difficult. I did have some shades that were like a dark, dark purple, and I had shades that were a dark, cool brown, but I feel like this is somewhere in between both of those. The dupe shade that I ultimately ended up going with is this guy right here, which is called Wine Stain from the Dose of Colors Marvelous Mauves palette. While I don't think this is quite as dark as Vortex is, I feel like, you know, it's got a similar-ish vibe to it. Next is the shade Hot Mess, which is a matte dark wine cranberry color. And this was one of those shades I thought I was going to be able to dupe like that, but was surprisingly a little bit more challenging just because I had some things that were more vibrant and kind of red toned and some things that were a little more brown, but nothing that was matte and quite exactly that shade. The closest thing that I came up with was from the Carity Picante palette. I reached for this shade here called Ebates or Ebates. I don't really know. I don't think this guy is quite as dark as Hot Mess, but I feel like it kind of does the job. And then Supernova, which is the metallic kind of cranberry shade. I figured we could reach for good old New Nude here and go in with the shade Kinky. Also in the New Nude, I feel like I could dupe the next two shades as well, which are Karma, which is a warm kind of rosy camel color, and Gold Glitch, which is kind of a pink gold duochrome. So for Karma, I'm going to use the shade Teddy here, and then for Gold Glitch, I'm going to use the shade Crave, which I mentioned previously. I thought that that one was going to dupe a different color, but I think this is better as a Gold Glitch dupe. Finally, we've got Frazzled, which to me looks like a peach gold duochrome deliciousness. This one I had a little bit of trouble duping as well. I decided to go for Hypersensual from the Secret palette from Nabla. Now this again is kind of more of a topper shade, so it doesn't really have the same smooth pigmented finish. It just has a very similar tone to it. Alright guys, and this is the entire palette dupe swatched. I feel like overall I did a pretty good job with this. I'm pretty impressed with what I was able to come up with. Is it exactly the same? No, obviously not. But I feel like if my ultimate goal is to be able to create looks that are similar to the ones that I would get with the Mercury Retrograde palette, I feel like this is a really, really great starting point for me. And just so you guys can see, I will also insert swatches of the original palette above and below the ones here, so you can look and see how good of a job I did. So with all said and done, it took me a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 palettes. 10 different eyeshadow palettes to dupe an 18 pan eyeshadow palette from Huda Beauty. Now, obviously, if you are not someone that has a gajillion eyeshadow palettes and you were eyeing Mercury Retrograde, it would be way cheaper to just buy that than to buy all of this. But if you, like me, have a ton of eyeshadow palettes, maybe this will be a good reminder to sit down and look through your collection before you actually go out and buy that new shiny palette that you're very tempted by. Because at the end of the day, eyeshadow is for us to put on our eyes. And so if we can ultimately create the same looks with what we already have, it maybe doesn't make sense for us to shell out more money to buy something new. Now, yes, there's also something to be said for formulas and textures, and maybe if a new palette has a formula that's significantly better than anything that you have in your collection, or the shades in that new palette have a significantly better formula than the dupeable version in your collection, and do you think it's something that you're going to wear all the time, maybe then you feel like it would be a smart purchase for you to make to pick up that new palette. Ultimately, long story short, is it's just about being a more informed consumer, about making smart purchases that seem to make sense for your makeup collection. So for me personally, while I think that the Mercury Retrograde palette is absolutely stunning, and of course there is a piece of me that wants it in my collection, I know that if what I really want are looks that are, inspired by that palette, I probably can still do them with things that I already have on hand. The benefit that I would be getting out of owning that palette would be the convenience of having everything all in one palette, because obviously for me to create this look that I'm wearing right now, even, I had to use several of the palettes in this stack. And of course, if I'm home, like, it's not that big of a deal. I can be, not lazy and go through things and pull everything out. But if, let's say, I was traveling, it would be a lot less practical for me to schlep, all of this around. So all in all, I would say I feel like this was a pretty successful experiment. I'm really glad that I was able to prove to myself that I do, in fact, own these colors, even the ones that were a little bit more unique and interesting, like those blue and purple tones. Just being reminded that I do have other pretty blue and purple eyeshadows that I haven't been reaching for nearly enough is making me feel inspired to start reaching for, like all of these guys again. And I suppose my wallet is also pretty happy because, quite frankly, I didn't really need to spend $67 on another eyeshadow palette right now. So now I would love to hear what you guys think. Are you interested in this palette? Do you think you could dupe it from palettes you already have in your collection? Do you already own the palette and love it? Do you think it's worth the money, or do you feel like it's not worth $67 and you would recommend we skip over it? Leave all your thoughts for us in the comments down below. And if there's another new palette launch that you guys would like to see me attempt to dupe, leave your suggestions for me in the comments down below. So yeah, thank you guys again so much for hanging out with me today. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you will consider giving it a thumbs up. I always really appreciate your support so much. And if you're new, I hope you'll consider subscribing, coming back, and hanging out with me again. And on that note, I'm gonna take these swatches off my arm before I get them all over this sweater. This thing is really loose and baggy, and I've had about 15 close calls just within the last 5 minutes alone. Anyway, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in my next video. Bye guys.